Okay, welcome everyone. This is a Tech Ability webinar on Assistive Technology, a starter kit with myself, Neil Beck, and Phil McIntyre as well. He's in the room and will be joining us partway through the slides to discuss some of the slides. So yeah, this has been provided by Carton Network and NatSpec. And the idea is that we've been out to lots of different colleges and centres. And one of the things they've asked is, well, where do we get started with equipment? So we've put together this webinar today to give you an outline of what you can use and where to start. So the aims of this webinar are to help you to understand how to identify the right equipment for your users, to use different examples to show how different equipment suits different environments and purposes, to give you some directions of where to buy the equipment, and to help you keep the equipment safe and in good order. So starting off with just some principles really, because what we don't want is we don't want people to have equipment that isn't used. So many organizations have done this where they've purchased a kind of set of equipment and then haven't used it, whether it's kind of scanning pens or other issues, other kind of things like that. So one of the first principles is to try before you buy, if you can. And this might mean contacting the supplier and seeing if they have some kind of system where you can try the equipment first. Lots of software in particular has free trials, so see if you can get those set up and tried first. As an organization, we don't always have kind of the ability to install things, so we have to kind of talk to our IT to install things, but sometimes it's worth having a standalone computer to kind of test software. You can also contact us as well if there's a particular piece of kit that you need or want to use, and just ask us how you can go about trying that. We can see if we can help you out. Think about future support and training. So especially recently, I've been working with some students with phone apps, and you can recommend one app and then within a year, kind of updates come along and it's no longer used. So actually some of the ones that initially seem more expensive offer you that future support, and often if they're more widely used in universities and things like that, then people are more likely to be there with the training, so that they can be there to support the user. You have to kind of think about building this in right from the start, and also support for the software too, so that you can go back to the manufacturer and kind of ask them for help on things, especially when you're looking at AAC devices or any kind of augmentative communication software. Then it's always worth having going to a company that gives you that support if you need it. Read reviews. So because technology is always changing, when I'm working with an individual or an organization, I often won't tell them what products to buy exactly, because that might change in a year, especially if you're looking at PCs and laptops and things like that. So the best way is to be proficient with Google and look at some review websites and kind of see what people have found with that. And always read them with a pinch of salt, of course, because you don't know what reviews are true sometimes. Get advice, so that can come from within your college, that can come from external links like ourselves, and also your IT team, or other people who are involved with technology. Use their sales team if you've got any questions and queries, because they're trying to sell the product to you, so you want to kind of make use of that. And once again, that can link in with the try before you buy, because you might be able to get free trials and demonstrations of the software or hardware. Consider the scale and the budget. So today I've been in a meeting looking at a particular type of tablet for some staff members, and actually there's potential of using that for students as well. So think about where you're going to be in a year's time or 2 years' time. What equipment are you going to need to buy, and what's going to be useful along the line. And of course, considering your budget as well. You want to kind of make the most. So it is about buying something that's going to give you hopefully many years of use rather than kind of short-term fixes that end up costing you more. Consult your staff and your users. So if you've done that try before you buy, then get them to have a go with it. And as much as possible, get their input before you buy things, because too many people buy the equipment first because they think the equipment's all singing, all dancing, and they're not looking at actually what the user needs and what their requirements are. So if you do that first, you're more likely to get the right piece of equipment. And value your time as well, because if a piece of equipment needs a lot of support, if then you need to kind of think about that and build in your time to that. But also, if you're shopping around and if you have a working solution and you found it and you're not sure it might not be the best one, then at some points, rather than spending hours and hours looking at it, it's sometimes worth buying. You have to kind of figure out how much your time is worth when you're looking at these things, because you can research forever. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to Phil now. Phil, are you there?
Yeah, thanks, Neil. I just wanted to talk briefly about this book. It's a free download, PDF download. It's called How Do You Know It? How Can You Show It? And it generally relates more to assessment than it does about specific technology, but the principles within it really apply to what we're talking about today. And it's a fantastic publication. It was published in 2004, but don't let that put you off at all. It's all about principles of how you assess and how you can gather data. So what it does is it goes through several things about looking at when you're using assistive technology. How do you measure what you're doing? How can you really be sure that that person who's using that particular piece of kit is using it more efficiently than if they were using their previous piece, or if they were using no assistive technology at all. So it's a really good way of changing your thinking, I guess, about this and looking at how to measure. And importantly, for what we're talking about today, it's about framing the question. So there's a few good examples, if you can jump me to the next slide, Neil, which are about how might you frame a question. So we often don't approach things in the right way. We can often say, right, well, I need to find out whether this person can access this technology to improve their literacy and their numeracy, and also gain access to different learning environments. And we're putting too much into the question. So you spend a long time. It spends a long time talking about in this book framing the question, so then it's something you can actually measure to see whether what you're doing and implementing is effective. So how this ties into what we're talking about today is when we're looking at equipment, really taking a step back before we even start buying things or ordering things, and looking at what we're trying to assess and how we're trying to assess it might well influence the purchases we make, or even the things that we try and borrow off somebody else to use in our assessments. So I'd highly recommend, there's a web link on your screen there, but just Google that whole title, How Do You Know It? How Can You Show It? And you'll find the free download. And if you've got nothing to read over the holiday period, I'd highly recommend it. It isn't a long book. It's a really easy read. But it really helps to frame your thinking about these kind of things, and bring you back to that point where you're saying, right, what's the reason we're doing it in the first place? How are we actually going to measure whether it's got an impact, rather than using our instincts or our feelings? We can actually try and measure something. So with that in mind, we're going to move on to a few case studies of the types of equipment that we might use and other people might use in their settings. So it's back to you, Neil.
Great, thanks, Phil. Yeah, Phil actually set me his homework to read up on how how can you show it? So yeah, I made sure I got through that. It's really useful, and it's nice that it's written from an assistive technology point of view. There aren't that many resources out there that focus in on assistive technology like that. So really valuable resource. So I was asked to provide what equipment that I thought would be useful. So I've picked out some key ones here. Dragon, naturally speaking, is one that I'm always kind of promoting and pushing at the moment. In general, because voice technology has come on so far, I won't go into depth with it because we have a separate webinar based on voice control, which goes through all the different options. But at the moment, Dragon is certainly one that I keep in my kit and always make sure is available. And there's almost an unwritten piece of kit in my list there, which is a laptop. So my one laptop can have any number of different software solutions and inbuilt settings, and Dragon's one that I have on that. So students can control using their voice, and that helps anyone with various kind of learning disabilities, and anyone that struggles to put their ideas down in an effective way. So recently I've been working with some people with memory issues, and by the time they've typed out their answer, they've kind of forgotten where the thread and where that's going. So Dragon's been really useful to get down their ideas as quickly as possible and put them there on the page so that they can go back through and check them through afterwards. Google Chrome I've picked out there because a lot of the time at the moment I'm using various different add-ins. So in the Chrome kind of add-on store, there's some really useful little ones that you can have there. One of them is the Dragon one that you can see there, which makes sure that Dragon works in there. There's some clear reader kind of ones that you use with Chrome. So Chrome's quite versatile, and I think in the future there's going to be more things that are launched there to help you with that. So I've included that. Xmind is mind mapping software, and I've used that recently with someone who works much better with visuals. So with that mind map, you can have the central issue that you want, and then dotted around it have the different elements of that, and then you can kind of tease that out more with pictures, audio, and other kind of things that you want in there. And what I particularly like, and what worked for this individual very much, was the fact that you can then turn that into an essay plan. So it'll take everything that was in that mind map and pull it out into an essay plan, and it just gives them that starting point. So, I mean, I would have found that really useful, and it is finding that equipment that software and those solutions that aren't just useful for students that we identify with disabilities, but actually increasing the accessibility for everyone. And lots of people do work better visually, and it gives them that starting point for essays which are quite daunting. So that's on my list. Touchscreen, very simple, but the amount of people now who are using direct access, you've got kids who are growing up with phones and tablets, and direct access becomes their normal way. So when you show them a mouse, well, actually they're not going to be as familiar with that. So touchscreen is often something that I try and build into assessments, just to see how people's access is with that. The individuals that we've worked with sometimes will be able to swipe and pinch and do lots of different gestures that can help with the touchscreen. And of course, with the touchscreen as well, you can get the on-screen keyboard, which includes some basic level of prediction. So touchscreen opens up lots of different options. The one thing to consider when you're using a touchscreen is to select things to open when you single click. So if you tap Windows and start typing in single click, it will give you an option there where you can choose to open things rather than tapping twice, which might be quite difficult for students, then just once. So touchscreen definitely on the list. And finally, I thought I'd bring something that I was using more recently, and that's LightKey. And if you just type it in Google, you'll find it. You can download it, and it will just run quite seamlessly in the background and give you a prediction option for many different windows. There are lots of features in it, so you can actually get the feedback of how an individual's working with it, what words they're using more often, and it will learn how you type and what words you use. But it's also really low profile for students or individuals who maybe don't want the stigma of using software that looks different or some big kind of bright window. Then it's a really low impact piece of software, but also with lots of features. Early days, so I've only been using it a week or so, but yeah, I chose to put it into my list. So I'll hand you back over to Phil now. And okay. Phil's going to be talking about Beaumont College. Over to you, Phil.
Thanks, Neil. I don't know. I think all I can see is your webcam rather than the presentation.
Oh, sorry, I turned up the wrong one. There we go.
All right, cool. Yeah, I mean, it's great to see you, but I'd rather see the presentation. Sorry. So I just wanted to talk through a few things that at Beaumont, in my Beaumont College role, I was trying to think around what could I not do without when assessing students, and I think one of my primary tools that I use extensively is Grid 3. Now, it's not a cheap piece of software, Grid 3, and the primary purpose of it, the primary design of it, is for communication, to use as a kind of grid-based communication system. But at Beaumont, we use it extensively for all educational purposes, and the massive benefit of it is that if someone is a mouse user or a touchscreen user or a switch user or even an eye gaze user, they're still able to access any content which you create. So there's loads of pre-made content for Grid 3. Unfortunately, a lot of it is aimed at younger users, so visually it's quite young. But the power of it really is that you've got a blank canvas to create interactive resources, quizzes, even using things that contain web browsers, and it's all contained in the one package, and therefore the accessibility is all there. It's all built in. And what you can do as well with Grid 3 that's really powerful is you can create one resource, and then different users can access that resource, but they each have their own preset accessibility. So if someone was an eye gaze user, then that would be set into their profile, and you wouldn't have to change that every time when you open that particular resource. They would just jump straight into it. A large keyboard. I was trying to think of a kind of keyboard and mouse hardware that I really couldn't do without, and I think probably large keyboards I recommend more than any of that other kind of mouse and keyboard peripheral hardware, just because there's an awful lot of occasions when in an assessment I'll just offer someone a large keyboard and say, what do you think? And an awful lot of times they'll say, yep, that's much better, and be quite happy to adopt it. It's surprising how many young people come to our college who haven't seen or used a large keyboard before. You think they may well have had the opportunity, but so even for people who don't necessarily have a visual impairment diagnosis or anything that might point you towards them needing a larger keyboard or any physical difficulties, often I find that they'll prefer it, and that preference will really help to make their typing much more efficient. I'd also put Clara Read or Read and Write on there. I'm not particularly bothered which. A lot of people have a very strong preference between the two, but I find that most people use roughly the same functions, which is the ability to be able to read out some text and to find some definitions. There are some users of those pieces of software who use the advanced functions, but most of the time what people are looking for is I want that read out to me, or I want to have a definition and some assistance with my my grammar and my literacy. The other end of the scale, probably a switch on a Manfrotto arm. If I've got one of those, I can do, I think, most investments and give users a chance to get a switch in the right position. So these Manfrotto arms that you can see on your screen, they are fully adjustable, so I can clamp it to a wheelchair, I can clamp it to a desk and adjust it till it gets into exactly the right position. It's not a great long-term solution, but for assessment they're brilliant because you can maneuver it exactly where you want. And finally, I'm finding more and more the piece of kit that I can't do without is the learner's own phone or laptop or their tablet. You can find out an awful lot about someone's access by just watching them and talking to them about the way they use their own device. And obviously more and more young people arrive at colleges and they've got their own device with them, and that's a really good starting point to be able to chat to them or observe them and say, how do you use this, how are you interacting with it. And even if that's something like a laptop that they might have had for 4 or 5 years, that gives you a starting point to be discussing, well, why are you using a laptop? Why have you not moved on to maybe a tablet? Do you prefer it? All those kind of things. You get an awful lot of insights just from that. So the next thing we did just recently, we did a little straw poll. So it's not just Neil and my opinions, but it's a very limited pool. But we just asked 5 assistive technologists from different settings that same question, really. What are the 5 pieces of hardware and software that you simply could not do without? So it's a bit of a desert island discs type question, that if you could only have 5 pieces of kit in addition to your laptop and your iPad, what would you not do without? And 2 of those assistive technologies were from general further education, 2 were from specialist further education, and 1 was from charity RNIB, Royal National Institute for the Blind. And it was roughly, I have to say, as I expected, but it was more spread out than I expected. So if you could show the next slide, Neil, there's a massive wide range of things that people say that they couldn't do without. So once we put them all together, it just shows us that we'd really struggle to put together a definitive assistive technology assessment kit. So if you came to this webinar expecting to go away with a list that then you could go and buy and have the definitive kit, I'm afraid you're going to be disappointed. But this shows you the range. Dragley, this is a word cloud. If you've not seen word clouds before, basically the things that which got mentioned more are larger. So the things like built-in accessibility and Dragon naturally speaking, read and write, screen readers, and things like that are very frequently mentioned. But then obviously everyone's got their own tools that they like working with, or that fit their own particular group of individuals that they're assessing on a regular basis. So things like reading pens and headsets, Google Chrome, Neil's already mentioned, things like that all come into it. But it's what that individual as an assistive technologist has found useful. So again, just to highlight the important thing about the webinar today is we're talking about the rules that you might use to select your own kit. So hopefully we've talked a bit about why we would want our kit, but it's more back to what we were talking about at the beginning. Use your own, when you're buying the equipment, look at the principles of what you need it for and why you need it and how to get the best out of your kit.
Yeah.
It may well be, I don't know what you think about this, Neil, it may well be that we could produce a resource in future which would be more tailored towards individual environments, and saying if you're working in this environment, you might like to consider these pieces of equipment in your assessment kit. But again, that could be endless. We could do a few examples of that, but really the important thing is getting the principles right.
Yeah, I think people very much have to kind of pull out what they think will be useful for them. So, looking on that word cloud, there's some things like Sonocent Audio Note Taker that takes notes throughout a session, and I think that would be very widely used in kind of GFE and mainstream,
Yeah,
but less so in a specialist setting. And then if you look to NVDA, that would be almost definitely RNIB. Have kind of chosen that one. So I think, yeah, people very much have to kind of work out what is right for their settings, and their students have to come first. And I don't know if it's the same with you, Phil, but our students change every year as to their requirements. So what might be really useful this year, it might be different next year.
definitely, and it comes back, I think, to what you were saying earlier, Neil, about if you've got any resources that you can download things and give them a trial, and let the students try them for a decent period of time, then you don't feel like you're spending a lot of money even to get them into your own kit, um, when you don't have to, when it might prove that the next year you don't need it, or the next 3 or 4 years you don't need it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
great.
Okay, shall we chat about where to buy things from? Um, so again, there's no hard and fast rules here. Um, there's a large amount of resellers out there of assistive technology kit, but again, um, it does depend on exactly what you're getting as what's the best place to buy it. Um, I think it can be really good to buy things, if you can, direct from that software developer or the hardware manufacturer, if possible, because you've got a direct line back then to the developer, and they've obviously got more of a vested interest in keeping you happy. And making sure that your needs are met, and that the young people that you work with, that their needs are met. So look at if you can get things direct from the developer or manufacturer. If you can't, because not everybody sells direct, then you're looking at resellers, and the usual suspects out there are Inclusive Technology, people like Microlink, who are a bit more mainstream but have a lot of assistive technology kit as well, and Sight and Sound, particularly specialist in VI kit. But another good tip is that if you're buying a piece of software, so a good example is JAWS, which is a US manufactured piece of software, you should look for the UK reseller who's the main dealer, if there is such a thing. So if that company employs a main dealer, they're going to have the most knowledge, and they're going to have the fastest and most direct line back to the manufacturer. So to use that example of JAWS, the screen reader, Sight and Sound are the main UK dealer, and they have the line back to the company. So I would always recommend people buy JAWS through Sight and Sound. And that will be different for everyone, and you can't always often find that out. But sometimes it's a good tip to do that. You can also do your sort of one-stop shop if you're assessing for disabled students allowance. Someone is, if that's applicable to any students, then often you can work with those people to do an assessment, and they also supply the kit as well. Now, there's various arguments around this, that whether they've got a vested interest in the kit, but the majority of companies that do that are very ethical, and they sign up to sort of an ethical code of conduct. So they're not going to provide students with things that they don't need. They're not going to put it in the assessment just so that they can get the sale out of it. And don't forget the usual suspects where you might buy anything: Amazon, eBay. Tap it into Google and see what happens on the Google Shopping, whether you can find a better price for Google searching all the sales websites. And I'm not quite sure, Neil, you put this comment at the bottom, utilize your networks.
So bearing in mind that we've got people within the Carton network, I know what Carton are very good at is making sure that equipment finds a good home. So if there's any equipment that you've got that's surplus to requirements, you can put it through the cart and emails. And likewise, if you're looking for something, you can also ask that way. And I'm sure if there's anyone outside of that, so kind of through NatSpec, if you just let us know any equipment that you're either kind of looking for or have surplus to requirements, then we can see what we can do. No promises, but so that's where to buy from. And then the important question that I suppose we can't miss really is what do you do when you get the products? So we're actually looking in National Star. We're actually tagging our products now, and we're going to be kind of putting them through an asset management system. But every different organisation has to decide how they're going to keep things safe. I mean, for us, we find things like switches and joy cables often go missing quite easily. So we have to be kind of clear who's responsible. So we've got a kind of signing in and signing out system. We've got clear expectations from them of kind of how long they've got it and how they're going to use it. That they're not just going to give it out to someone else and then it goes missing. And yeah, we've got a very high-tech way of marking them with nail varnish. So different teams have different colors nail varnish, and we use it that way. So another low-tech solution there.
Okay, I wonder if I can give you an alternative to that as well.
Yeah, please do.
We started a little system at Beaumont College. This is specifically for either high value kit or kit that generally gets loaned out often. And we've started putting RFID radio frequency tags on devices. And because all of our members of staff have a badge, which also works by an RFID tag to let them in the front door, they can scan their badge and then they can scan the piece of equipment. And the important thing for us then is that we know who was the last person to have it. When they bring it back, they also have to scan it back in. But if something is missing and we need it, we at least have got a name of the person who took it out, rather than it just being someone walking out of the room and saying, "Oh, by the way, I've got this." So whatever you use, nail varnish or fancy RFID tags, it's important, I think, to know, as Neil said, who's responsible for that, or who was the last person responsible for that.
Yeah, I think there's some of the equipment's quite expensive, and so even some of the kind of cheaper equipment, if you go through a lot of it, then suddenly your budget that you had for this is going to be, running over. One of the important things, as I said earlier, to value your time is to make sure there's time to roll these out as well. So considering training and support, not just for the individual using them, but for the support staff. And if they're going to be going on to use that in another environment, whether that's a different college or at home, then trying to think about what resources you need to create so other people can carry on using this. We never like to give people solutions that just work while they're here at college. We want to give them things that they're able to go on and use whatever they go on to. Have an end of life plan is a very good idea. Lots of IT teams are quite good at this. So if you talk to them, they've probably already got an end of life type cycle with laptops and things like that. And the idea is that if you sell it at a certain point, you get enough value back from that. And then that can be kind of put back into your budget. It also saves time because obviously as devices get older, then they have more and more issues. So you're actually building that into your kind of plan of how you use the equipment is kind of how long are you going to use it. So some things will just go forever until they break. So things like switches, other things like tablets, particularly iPads, you need to be thinking about, okay, when do we need to update these and when does that need to come in? And ultimately, the most important thing is to launch them, is to get them out there, make sure that they're being used with, as we said earlier, that kind of outcome drive. So you're actually deciding that we're going to use these products in a meaningful way for our students or users. So yeah, that's what we'd like you to do, is go out there, test drive the products that you've already got, set your plan, set budgets, check your funding sources, consider how do you know it and how are you going to show it. So a kind of a real world example of that was with dictation. I worked with a student and got them to work as much as they could in this task in half an hour, just using a keyboard, printed that out, and then got them to do the same using their voice, printed that out. And the voice one was noticeably longer and more complex vocabulary used, and the whole piece of work was just better quality. So think about how you apply that to the different things that you're buying. Are they actually going to work, and how are you going to show that they're valuable? Because if you show that they're valuable, then you're more likely to get support in future when you bring in technology. Especially with people whose budgets are tight, you'll often have to work with one student first and show it as a case study that this is valuable and this works and this is actually a really good way of our budgets being used. And then once you've shown it, you can roll that out. And feedback to us. We'd love to hear if this has helped you. We'd love to hear if there's any particular technologies that we've spoken about today that you'd like to know more of. We are aiming to be responsive to the network's needs. So if there's something you need, we're going to try and cover you, whether that's through web resources or webinars or visits. So let us know. Anything to add on that, Phil?
No, I think you've summed it up there nicely, Neil. So that's great.
Great, thanks. So yeah, thank you for tuning in today. We'll allow a few minutes for questions if anyone's got any. You can drop us an email there, techability@natspec.org.uk, or Twitter @tech_ability1. And our updated YouTube webinar channel is there. And so you can search for that and look through our other webinars. As we discussed, the dictation that we spoke about earlier, and others are there. And we're going to leave those there available, and you can use those for your CPD. So if you've got a team that you want to train up on these things, bring them in, and then you can show them one of these webinars and generate discussion and debate, and yeah, as always, feedback to us. So thank you very much for tuning in.
Okay, if you do have any quick questions, the chat box should be towards the bottom right of your screen or somewhere on your screen. You can quickly put a question in there, but if we don't get a question in the next minute or so, we'll call an end to the webinar. Thanks a lot.